It's way past my bedtime, but this is Vodcast 3. Bye-bye.
Thank you, son. All right, this is Vodcast 3, and we are talking about developmental pathways, risk and resilience, and competence today. So remember, with developmental psychopathology and with that perspective, we acknowledge that disorder does not come out of the clear blue sky, but psychopathology emerges gradually within the context of normative development. So we can think of development as progressive adaptations or maladaptations to changing circumstances. So that's one definition of development that we can think of. We also want to bring up this idea of cascades of development or developmental cascades. It says here, cascades of circumstances, reactions, cumulative consequences that spread across domains and over time. So as we're thinking about psychopathology emerging in the context of normal development, sometimes one thing goes wrong and then it triggers a chain reaction, right? So for example, maybe a student or a child, his or her mom gets diagnosed with a serious illness such as cancer. Suddenly then the mom is not engaged with the student's activities in school, is not supportive with homework, and because he or she can't be anymore, and then the student starts experiencing some school failure, and then self-efficacy goes down, depression kicks in, they're upset about their mom, there's marital stress. So all of these sorts of things you can think of as a chain reaction, otherwise known as a developmental cascade, where one area of dysfunction starts leading in a chain reaction to other sorts of problems. Okay, two principles related to developmental pathways or developmental trajectories that I want to talk about are equifinality and multifinality. So equifinality is a principle that describes the fact that you could have three children with very different beginnings who all arrive at the same outcome. Okay, so they're diverse in terms of their original circumstances. That's why we have the pink guy with the smiley face, the green guy, or the orange guy here with the sad face. And somehow they all end up developing antisocial behavior. That's known as equifinality. Different beginnings, same outcome. By contrast, we have multifinality, and this is really just the opposite. So this is where there is something in common at the beginning among a number of people, but they all have very different outcomes in the end. So maybe we have three children who all experienced abuse and maltreatment in childhood, and the way that emerged later on in life might be depression for one child, anxiety in another child. It might have led to aggression in a third child, and I could have a fourth child on here who doesn't have any of these disorders, who managed to fare just fine in spite of that maltreatment in childhood. So that demonstrates the idea of multifinality. Same initial circumstances, but different outcomes. Okay, so now I want to show up here some additional possible developmental pathways or trajectories that we could see. Okay, so a version of this is in your textbook, but they're all overlaid on top of each other. I just want to take each one at a time. So one possibility is stable adaptation. So remember, adaptation is similar to competence. A child who's showing very good functioning. Remember, we talked early on about optimal adaptation, poor adaptation, adequate adaptation. So somebody who has stable and high adaptation is faring well at the beginning and continues to fare well, for example, over the course of adolescence. So I said here that the y-axis represents poor to high adaptation, or poor to very good optimal adaptation. And then the x-axis represents time passing, like aging, maybe early adolescence, late adolescence, something like that. Stable maladaptation would be another possible pathway or trajectory, and that would be that someone is not faring well, maybe at the beginning of adolescence, and they continue to not fare well and function well. So maladaptation seen all throughout that particular trajectory. It's constant and stable, but it's poor. Then we have something here, reversal of maladaptation, which is cool. This is when somebody suddenly gets a boost, and so they haven't been functioning or coping very well, but then something happens, maybe an environmental change, maybe they changed schools, maybe they had an eating disorder and they finally got the medical help and psychotherapy that they needed, or something wasn't going well, but then some environmental event happened that improved their trajectory, and now suddenly they're having more optimum adaptation, so that's great. Not so great is the decline of adaptation pathway, where someone is faring very well and then some event happens that leads to a decline. It could be development of a physical health problem. It could be parents get divorced. Somebody has something tragic happen in their lives, but they're doing well, and then suddenly it's very clear at the moment where something goes wrong, then the adaptation declines. Temporal maladaptation is when things are going well, high adaptation or optimal adaptation, and then there's a dip for some reason, but then they recover and fare well again. Sometimes the example used with this is to talk about someone who maybe has some illicit drug use or something, and so they're involved in a gang or have a very bad peer group for a while that is a bad influence, but then they recover from that. Okay, 2 other points to keep in mind. That one thing we learned from the equifinality and multifinality principles, as well as all of these different pathways, the current adaptation level does not necessarily predict how someone's going to be doing later on, because we see multiple times where this person was doing well and later they were still doing well. This person was doing well, later they were not. This person was doing well, suddenly they weren't, later they were again. So we can't necessarily rely on current adaptation level to be able to reliably predict later functioning. As we'll see as we go through the course, that scientists and researchers are mapping developmental trajectories of very specific disorders, for example, autism, and we will learn about what are some of the most common pathways for particular psychological disorders that we study, and we'll see that for many disorders there are examples of both very stable and gradual pathways, as well as pathways or trajectories that are not stable and that are that change. All right. Well, sorry. Okay, so this little girl up here is asking, how do parents influence developmental trajectories? Well, there's 3 different ways that parents can influence their kids' developmental trajectories. One is that they can initiate trajectories for the kids. So maybe you have an idea in your head that you were a varsity soccer player and scholar athlete, and you really want your kid to be involved in soccer, so you sign them up for soccer. And you talk about soccer a lot, and you kick the ball around in the yard, and so you initiate a particular trajectory of developing that athletic skill or that soccer ability. Another thing you can do is that parents support whatever trajectory the child is on. So maybe they initiated this athletic development trajectory, and then they do things to support it. They continue to sign the child up for sports. They, often on the weekends play ball with their kid. They buy the best equipment and, sign them up for a variety of activities, things like that. Mediating trajectories. This has to do with how parents can help children deal with stress or challenges that they encounter while they're on the trajectory. So maybe the soccer team gets very challenging and the kid wants to quit. So maybe you can give some extra support or talk to the coach or whatnot. And the soccer example is a pretty low stakes example, so it could be something more intense where there are some really stressful challenges, for example, with peer relations or bullying or things like that. And the parents can help mediate those trajectories and not allow the kid to feel discouraged or very stressed, so the parent can kind of build them up and encourage them that they can continue to be okay. What is kids' role in their developmental trajectories? Well, they react to the trajectories that their parents initiate for them, right? So they either say, I hate playing soccer, or I love it, or I don't want to go to the school anymore, or these kids are mean to me and take me out of the school. They control their own effort, so when they're on the soccer field, they are deciding how engaged they're going to be. When they are with that group of friends at school that they're a little uncomfortable with, they're deciding how hard they're going to try to be friends with those people and work on that. And they initiate their own pathways. They come home from school and say, you know what, I think I want to do ballet instead. Okay. 2 other terms I want to introduce, coherence and adaptational failure. They're pretty straightforward. We talk a lot when we're talking about trajectories and pathways, we're looking at change over time. What did the beginnings look like, and then what do the later developmental outcomes look like? So coherence describes any situation where we can draw meaningful links between early developmental variables and later outcomes. Okay, so one quick example, a child is neglected in infancy, doesn't form solid attachments with their caregiver. Later on in childhood, the child might have an inability to regulate emotions because they didn't learn in infancy how their emotions could reliably elicit certain responses from their caregivers, right? So ideally, babies cry, that draws the caregiver in, and they go, okay, when I cry, my needs will be met. But if they cry and they're screamed at for crying, then they're not learning how to regulate their emotions to get their needs met. And so then later in life, they stifle their emotions, perhaps. So we might say that these two are connected, and it would be an example of coherence. Adaptational failure is anytime a child shows failure to master or progress in accomplishing developmental milestones. So that's similar to the idea of poor adaptation, but it's just kind of another way of saying it. In one particular instance, we might say someone showed adaptational failure in terms of developing language at the right age, or in terms of developing their identity or something. Okay, competence was another big theme in this section of the reading. So we can think of competence as similar to adaptation, the ability to successfully adapt in the environment, effective functioning in important environments. All kids display various domains of competence and incompetence. So that's really important to think about. Again, it's developmental psychopathology. So what we're talking about here applies to kids who have psychopathology as well as typically developing kids who don't show signs of disorder. So all kids, even those with disorder, still will have domains of high competence. And even kids who don't have disorders have areas of incompetence, right? Said another way, there's this other term called arenas of comfort, and you can review some of this in your text. It's discussed there. This little girl says, my arenas of comfort are art and soccer and playing with girls in my neighborhood. So these are domains in which a child feels confident and comfortable, at ease, low stress, where they feel like, I can do this, I got this, and again, they're feeling competent and they're comfortable with their achievements in those particular domains. Developmental tasks, such as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that preschoolers should be using language to express themselves, and they should be able to understand language. And preschoolers should develop compliance, right? They should know how to start to follow rules and listen to authorities. In adolescence, they should be forming an integrated sense of self and identity, and they should be developing close friendships. So these are developmental tasks associated with certain developmental periods. And so we can use these developmental tasks as benchmarks to gauge whether or not a child is showing competence or not. And finally,